Welcome to episode 85 of the Camerosity Podcast, the world's #1 open source film photography podcast. My name is Mike Ekman, and we are back with a new episode. For this one, we are recording at a special time to accommodate our special guest. Joining us from Vienna, Austria is Mr. Jo Geier from Mint and Rare Cameras and the Wetzlar Camera Auctions. If one rare camera auctioneer isn't exciting enough, we also have with us the Camerosity Podcast official Leica specialist from Tamarkin Cameras in Chicago, Dan Tamarkin. Before we get to our guests, let's do some introductions. From Gainesville, Florida is Mr. Anthony Rue. Hey Anthony, you've had a lot of different jobs. Has an auctioneer ever been one of them?
No, I think I'd get too tongue-tied trying to rattle off the auctions prices that fast. I just never done that.
Next, from Yellow Springs, Ohio is Paul Reibel. Hey Paul, have you ever considered shutting down your eBay store and opening your own camera auction house?
You know, being totally opposed to the concept of an auction, since I've never had anything but bad luck with auctions, maybe that's what I should do.
Theo's going to be with us a little bit later today, so let's just get started and open up the doors to all the people sitting in the waiting room. Joining us from Mint and Rare Cameras and the Wetzlar Camera Auctions is Jo Geier. Jo, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And welcoming back our official Camerosity auctioneer, Dan Tamarkin. Dan, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, we got a bunch of returning callers. I see Miles Libak, I see Wayne, I see Ira, I see Wes Loder for 2 weeks in a row. Welcome back, Wes and Ira. Gheerwijn, Clicque. Welcome, Gheerwijn.
Hey.
I had to ask ahead of time for a tutorial on pronouncing your name, and I loved that Clicque just works well with cameras. So
it does, and I'm into computers as well, so it works both ways.
Okay,
I'm a software engineer actually, so yeah.
And where are you calling from?
Ghent, Belgium.
Belgium. Okay, so we have Belgium, we have Austria, we have Germany, of course the US. I'm going through the list here. Australia, of course. Theo, it is 6 a.m. there, so he's got a huge pot of coffee for us. We've done auctions shows before. As you guys know, Dan's been on the show many times. He's shared with us many stories. But, when you get into the world of vintage camera auctions, and when I say auctions, we're not talking eBay here. We're talking the real deal, registered bidders, the best of the best of the best. Dan's up there with Tamarkin Auctions. Wetzlar's up there. Flint's and Westlick are the 4 biggest ones out there that you could potentially pick up something from. And I've drooled over some of the cameras that each of those auctions have sold. And I just think it's interesting to hear some of the stories and how you guys acquire that stuff and what does it look like to be able to play with some of these really, really cool cameras before you have to let them go to a buyer. But I want to start with Jo. Jo, welcome. We actually contacted, or actually I should rephrase that. Jo contacted us to correct something that we got wrong in an episode where we credited you for something you didn't do, or was that what it was?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so he wanted to know, he's like, love the show, guys, but you got it wrong. So Paul and I, that opened up the discussion for us to kind of welcome him on the show. So we're really glad you could make it. Jo, why don't you just sort of give us your origin story? How did you get into what you do? Tell us a little bit about Mint and Rare. Tell us a little bit about Wetzlar Auctions.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me again. Nice to see some familiar faces here and hear some familiar faces afterwards, I would say. I started not in camera retail, but I went to camera fairs since I was 8 years old, I would say. And I would do all those lens caps and filterings and manuals and small bits and pieces, And I could earn 10% of what I sold from my father's stock, which he had on the table. So I got in that quite early, into that. And I think it was when I was around 13 years of age, I went to London with my Yashica FXD, my first SLR, not a simple point and shoot camera. And I took 48 pictures on a roll of film, which isn't quite possible. And there was no filming. So I decided I should go for the gear and not for the images. Then I would say I went full on into gearhead mode. So I like playing around with the stuff. I like the feel. I like to handle it, to focus, to push on a on a lock, on a focusing tab, and just move things around, you know. And I soon got into Leica when I started at Leica shop with 17, and stayed there for 10 years and was also involved in the auctions there. And after 10 years, I thought it would be best if I could do it the way I want to do it, and started Mint and Rare. In 2018, I sat with Lars Nettobil and David Pizza, and we had some thoughts over the years before that we want to do an auction. Nothing against Tamarkin right now, right here, or any other one. We wanted to do it our way, and 2019 we started Wetzlar Camera Auctions very successfully, thanks to all the vendors and participants here. Now it's the 7th auction we do, always in October, just one auction per year. Fine selected cameras and lenses, mainly 75% lights and Leica items, and the others are quite unusual to extremely rare non-lights and Leica products, I would say. So it's a fine catalog of 250 pieces each year. Hunting, of course, is the most fun. Sometimes it's quite hard to let things go. Dan would know, Paul would know, and many others as well. So there were some pieces which I think I should have bought myself, you know, at least a dozen or more.
That's what I was going to ask you. How many of them never end up getting sold?
Not too many, actually.
That's probably good.
Because, no, I love cameras, but it's an everyday business, 24/7, basically. If you're self-employed, you will know. And if I would bring more than 5 cameras at home, my wife would kill me immediately. So I'll have to keep them here in the shop. I can play with everything every day, you know. I can use whatever I want.
For those of you listening, for the most part, every single thing Joe has said, Dan has had a big smile on his face and he's nodded. So I feel like what applies to him, you've experienced as well, right?
Absolutely. I cannot say enough good things about Wetzlar Camera Auctions, both Joe and Lars and David. There's just, I mean, there's really 2 outfits in the world that I think, if you'll permit me saying, I don't usually speak like this, but the very best of the best of the best occurs in the Western Hemisphere with Wetzlar Camera Auctions and Joe and Lars's and David's auction, and in the in the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere, Tamarkin Camera Auctions. I don't really consider any other auction house a competitor, and in fact, we don't really compete. I mean, I send people potential consigners over to Lars and Joe with some frequency, and it goes the other way too, likewise. And so while I like to watch the Leica Westlic auction or whatever it's called, it's kind of fun. Really, the only people that I really pay attention to what they're doing are Lars and Joe.
So there have been instances where you've been aware of maybe the same seller, and do you just kind of say, I'll take this one, or do you just do like, well, he's in America, so Dan might be better suited to it, or like,
yeah, I would say that's probably a pretty good characterization. I mean, I can tell you that Wetzlar Camera Auctions, I think it was in their first or second camera auction, sold the very first Leica 3D to be produced. And that was found at, I think, a Pennsylvania garage sale. And the guy called me and I said, you know, I got all hot and bothered and I got very excited. And there was a little bit of saliva dribbling out. And I said, I'd love to have it. I'll come to you and collect it. I'd love to meet you, take you to lunch and all that kind of stuff. But if you really, really want the best possible outcome in the world, it's got to be Lars and Joe. And much as I would love to have had that consignment, the fact of the matter is that a lot of the biggest buyers for the really rare stuff are still in Europe. And so they very often are the very best positioned, both geographically and in their acumen, to be able to actually get the top dollar for some of these super rare items.
So back to you, Joe. Mint and rare, you still operate as just like a retail, right?
Yeah.
How do you decide between something that gets sold through retail and what goes to auction? Is that all determined by the seller?
All items in the auction come from private individuals or from other dealers. Nothing that I buy in the shop goes to the auction because I sell it retail in the shop. So people obviously know about auctions, this auction, that auction, and Tamarkin auction as well. For the most part, they decide how to part with it, and where to part with it. Also, if it's a really unusual thing, like one of a kind, or it's so rare that you don't know the exact value of a piece, you tend to put it in the auction, obviously,
Sure.
because then you can maybe expect a huge difference to a price anybody can offer in a direct purchase or direct sale. So, of course, we recommend to put that stuff into the auction. We want as much the best outcome as the consignor, obviously, because we participate on that. I think in my world, nothing is really common. But for stuff that is slightly more used, then we would like to put it in the auction because we have to be very selective. It's only 250 pieces once a year. We recommend to the sellers or to the owners, if you can buy something every day anywhere through eBay or wherever, put it with a fixed price into the shop. And if you don't know the exact value, or we see a realistic chance that it exceeds an estimate, then you should put it in the auction.
For the auction, a very high percentage of those items are a consigned auction. They're consigned by sellers.
100%.
100%. That's what I was going for. And then if for example, what you just said was that if the item isn't quite to the level that you'd like to have in your 250 pieces, then you're willing to take that into your store and sell it as a consignment or perhaps purchase it from the seller itself.
Both ways, yeah, exactly.
Dan, do you work the same way?
Yeah, almost identically. The only difference I would say between what Joe just described and Tamarkin auction is, first of all, there's a couple of differences. One is that we sometimes have a lot more stuff because we're less picky, and I can talk more about that. But I live in a world where I have a lot more common and non-rare kind of user grade stuff. And so we do exactly the same thing. If it's not rare or very fine or very clean, then we sell it at retail. So the other difference between Tamarkin auctions and Wetzlar auctions is that we own some of the stuff that we put on the auction block. So our auctions are not necessarily 100% consigned. It's a distinction, a difference without a distinction without a difference. The idea being is that both auction houses, and really all of the auction houses that have been mentioned so far, put really rare or really clean items on the auction block. At Tamarkin, we tend to take things that are interesting. And that's not to say that the stuff everything that Wetzlar Auctions offers is interesting, very interesting indeed. What I mean to say is we sell a lot more pedestrian accessories. If you look at the beginning, the first 100 or so lots in our catalogs, they typically have a lot of tripod fixtures and viewfinders and little things because, like Joe, I am just crazy about all this stuff. I love it. And so I sometimes put more lots in our auction than I should. For example, last year we had 402 lots in our auction, and I almost couldn't speak for 3 days afterward. It was a grueling day. And so in the future, we're going to do more like Joe and Lars do, is we're going to do about 250 pieces, and we are going to, in the future, be a little more selective. But those are really the big differences, is in the amount of lots and what level are consigned.
And I could say, too, that coming from someone who I've personally never bought anything from either of you two, what Dan even describes as run-of-the-mill is still pretty good stuff. And what's great about having auctions like what you guys do is that you are the benchmark or at least you're able to set a benchmark for what this stuff is actually worth. You know, when something is incredibly rare and doesn't have a known value and it does sell, then that becomes the value.
Exactly.
You know, one of the kind stuff, no two cameras are exactly the same. I think everybody understands that. I had sent you that Ilford Witness, which didn't sell at all. So that set, well, it's not any higher than what this was. You know, the value was lower than that.
Right. Even in not selling, a price is a price is set.
Right. Any of us here, even first-time collectors, everyone has stumbled upon Collectiblend. And while I think that that site does provide value in identification, and in some cases can be used for evaluation, unfortunately, a lot of the estimates are wildly inaccurate. They could be based off of eBay auctions from 20 plus years ago, which don't apply to today. But when you have, you know, reputable auction houses, sold eBay auctions, what people actually will pay for something does help set the stage. And that's a resource that, you know, 20, 30 years ago, we just didn't have. You know, the McKeown's guy, Jim McKeown's books were useful because he would put an estimate of what something might be worth, but that was just based on the information he had at the time. So I love looking at what you guys sell and don't sell and being able to say, all right, well, that's about what that should be. It gives you a ballpark at least.
Absolutely. And keep in mind if you're looking online for an auction house's results, keep in mind that places like Live Auctioneers and Invaluable, they only report the sales that get made on their online portal. So if you look at our results, for example, or the results that Wetzlar publishes, Wetzlar Auctions publishes, they'll, you know, everything is there. The sold price of everything is there. But if you're looking online, be aware that if a winning bidder happened in the room or with a direct bid with the auctioneer, that might not be reported on the internet site.
Gotcha. Joe, for when you do your auctions, is any of it in person or is it 100% online?
No, it's a live auction. You can bid in the room, on the telephone, on the internet, or in any other way. But it's a live auction with an auctioneer, with a hammer,
Nice.
with everything, you know, with a preview, with a nice room, with some drinks and after party. So please come and join us.
It's an amazing experience. Their auctions are fabulous.
Awesome.
Dan, you've been there, no? You've been to Wetzlar, to one of our auction, huh?
Yes, I was at the very first auction that Wetzlar did, and I bought a New York Standard because nobody else was bidding, and I couldn't understand why this was going to sell for so little money. So I put up my hand. I bought that, and I bought a Hammer Tone Visoflex 3, yeah. And it was really a delightful experience. The room was beautiful. The auctioneer was very professional. Some of the biggest and brightest stars in collectible Leica were in the audience. And it was really, we just had a great time. I had a lot of fun. And I'll see you in May. I'll be in Vienna in May, Joe, so we'll catch up.
See you in May. May I jump in because a few things have been said in the past 2 minutes. I jumped in when you spoke about Collectiblend. I'm not the owner. I don't set the prices. I don't pay anybody to set the prices. No, it's a very nice guy who operates that website, and of course it's a nice way to get an idea of a possible range of a price. You know, sometimes he sets a price for a thing where something has been sold 25 years ago, and now a mint one doubles the price or halves the price for a heavy used piece. It's a nice ballpark, you know, but it's nothing definite. But it's good to have that at least for things you don't see on eBay.
To me, Collectiblend is invaluable. I mean, it's just a great resource for a seller.
Yeah.
It also is a double-edged sword, though, because if somebody that's one of my sellers wants to establish a price, they go to Collectiblend, and the first thing they see is the price on the right-hand side where it says mint.
Yeah.
And they don't realize that it could be only 5% of the total number of pieces available are going to be in that category. The majority of the pieces are going to be either average or below average. So people don't understand when they go to collective land that not their item may not be worth, and it probably isn't worth the highest price that they see on the listing. What I use it for actually is to go see what's available, because if I want to see how many other pieces are available, it does have those listings that are available on eBay. So you can go in and see what
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
is available, and that's helpful. And it was me that created the problem with Joe and giving him credit for Mint because Mint and Rare advertises on Collective Blend. Um, I think I see your banner on the splash screen. So and someone had told me, so it was all on me, not Mike or Theo or Anthony. But you corrected me, and I agree. The guy does a great public service by
Yeah.
maintaining that website.
And we're happy to be wrong. I mean, it happens. Sometimes, even during editing, I'll hear something that I or one of us said that's not quite right. And if it's way off, sometimes you'll hear, for those of you who've listened to every episode, you'll hear me interject, like, yeah, I completely screwed this part up. But if it's something minor, I kind of just let it slide, see who wins the prize for that week to call us out on something that we missed. But none of us, you get Wes Loder, for example, you specialize in Nikons, you specialize in the 10X2, Bob Rodoloni, there's certain people that are true historians about a specific camera. And, I like to think that Paul, myself, Theo, Anthony, we're jacks of all trade, but masters of none. We know a little bit about a lot of different things, but unfortunately it means we're going to get a few things wrong here and there. And that's part of the appeal. If I had to vet every single thing we said, we'd never get a single episode out. But I can keep talking forever. We do have quite a few guests here, so I kind of wanted to start off by opening it up to anybody who's joined us if they have any questions for Joe or Dan or us or anything. So don't all go speaking at once. The room's quite crowded. Does anybody have any questions?
I can go first.
Sure, Miles, go ahead.
I think this question is probably for both Dan and Joe, but I'm curious, in the era of the internet, the definition of rare has probably changed a fair amount. And but I'm curious, like, what is an item that you're waiting to show up in terms of maybe it's uncertain if one still exists or one hasn't come to auction in 20 years? What is there an item that pops to mind for you two that you're kind of waiting to see again, or still wonder if it's out there?
This is Dan. I'll tell you a quick story anecdote about a collection that I just retrieved. In this collection, I know that the gentleman had a TWO, which is a over and under stereo bracket for screw mount cameras. And it's one of the rarest accessories ever. It's one of the few items that I've never actually had and held. And I know that this collector had one. We could not find it. And we turned the house upside down. So that would be one of those items. But Miles, I agree with you that I think a lot, the internet has really changed the field in the Leica space and the collectible camera space. And a lot of it is terrific because more people can get involved. More people can get involved without having a store like Joe and I, or an auction house, or a room full of cameras. So one can be, if you'll pardon the expression, an armchair collector now with the internet, which is terrific. And I think that the information that the internet provides, it's, as Paul used the phrase earlier, a double-edged sword. It really is. I mean, it's wonderful that more people can get involved and more people become knowledgeable of these rarities or uncommon items. However, you get there's a lot of emotion and a lot of lack of understanding, I think, of the marketplace, and a lot of folks who just kind of like log on and start to bid or log on and start to show interest. I have a laundry list of things that I would like to find in the collectible space, and I'll gather that list as I listen to Joe's response to this question.
Well, it's obviously true that with eBay and the whole internet, you can find basically almost everything anywhere, anytime. We then as well, of course, had to specialize in something, and in the store it's mint and rare, so it's stuff you don't see every day, or in a very good condition, for example, because you can buy tons of screw mount Leicas in beat up condition at any time, anywhere. And we totally leave that aside, basically. In the auction, we do quite the same, but on a even more extreme level, because it's 250 lots, and as I said, very selected pieces, and then only we try to get the best of the best. You know, it's still hard, because with 20 years ago I did auctions with like 900 pieces, and this took a whole day, and this wasn't really fun. Not from the business side, and also not from the customer side, because if you sit like 9 or 10 hours in a room and you wait for something, that's also not very funny. So we decided we go into that direction to be more exclusive and selective. Bucket list items. Number one would be the second Ur-Leica, if it ever existed, and we don't know. This is in everyone's head, or in the back of his head, basically. But apart from that, I mean, this would be like, yeah, I would retire, maybe, you know.
Me too.
For those who don't know what a Ur-Leica is, could you explain what that is?
Well, it's Oscar Barnack's prototype of the prototype of the prototype, made in 1912, where he made test images to see. It was called the Lilliput, because he put it in his pocket and he traveled around, and then after or during World War I he put it aside, and from that development, the Leica Zero, or one or two cameras, one at least is confirmed, was made before the Leica Zero, but there is a second, maybe even a third one, because one camera is called prototype number 3, and there is nothing in between. So there must be something. The problem is nobody knows if that's still in existence or it has been disassembled, and you know, who knows. But this would be the dream, basically.
Like the missing link, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Didn't they estimate the third prototype was like 1918, 1919-ish? If it were made, that's probably...
Yeah, approximately 21,
right.
I feel. 20,
Oh, yeah.
20. But being more realistic, I would like to have a Shiru camera, but it's not a Leica camera. It's the first camera made in 1839. You know, the Shiru camera would be the more realistic dream. It was the first camera made 1839, daguerreotype camera. I mean, I don't know how many examples are still in existence and known. I think like 12 or 15, something like that. George Eastman House has one, for example, and a few other museums around the globe. So this would be a highlight, obviously, in my career. And maybe a Voigtländer metal camera would be nice, an original one, not the replica ones. But apart from that, I think I handled, or I had every major rarity in my hands at least once. Not necessarily sold it, because I've been in this game now 25 years, but 6 or 7 Leica Zeros in hand. So it's really hard that I find stuff I've never seen before, but it still happens. There are still things in our auctions, even if it's small stuff, viewfinders, cases, whatever. There are still things around I've never seen or nobody has seen before, you know, and then we're the first to print it in the catalog and to make a reference to that or set a price to it, which is extremely interesting. But apart from that, I'm happy if a regular Leica M3 in chrome finish with box and papers in like new condition walks into the in the shop. You know, it's not about black paint or 3 million or 5 million euros. It's beautiful condition, regular stuff for normal people, which used to be a tool. This was never a collectible. This wasn't a produced collectible like a limited edition or whatever. A regular camera in superb, pristine condition is sometimes even more rare. I've only seen like 3 completely new. I mean new. I make a big difference between new, like new, and mint. It's a huge difference. I've seen more black paint M3 in like new condition than chrome cameras.
Me too. Yeah. It's interesting.
Secondary cameras or whatever, you know, to professional photographers, and they put it, I don't know, as a spare into a locker or whatever. But a chrome camera was a user camera. It was for a professional or amateur or whatever. but they were used, you know, they were, and that's also rare, and that's also stuff that I'm after, basically.
I understand this year is the 100th year of Barnack Leica, no? Are you going to do something about it?
About 100 years, 1924. Well, we are not Leica. We're not related to Leica. We're not Leica owned. Leica did 2 teddy bears, as I got 2 for myself, and the Leica M11 glossy paint finish limited edition. But we ourselves try, of course, to get a very fine selection again. A beautiful Leica one, Anastigmat, L-Max, whatever, would be very fine. Obviously, that's 100 years from now. But we don't do any celebration of 100, whatever. That's up to the mothership company.
Exactly. It's going to be 2025 is going to be a year like any other for us at Tamarkin, and I suspect that Joe would echo this, where we're really fortunate to do this job and do what we love. And as it happens, we're both very good at it, if I do say so myself. But it's a joy. And it's still, you go into work every day, it's still work, but I'm surrounded by cameras. I mean, what could be better than that? We'll probably do some kind of celebration, but if you know me, you know that I like to celebrate everything all the time. And so we probably will do some celebration, but not anything specific for the 100 year, unless of course Leica gives me some advertising and fun money. And if Leica decides to give me some money, then we'll celebrate, throw a big party.
Now, has the internet sort of obliterated space as well, or is there a difference between what Dan can find in the U.S. and what Joe is going to find in Europe, as far as, you know, estates, barn finds, storage locker lots? You know, are there things that, just because of the vagaries of distribution over the years, that certain things arrived in the U.S. and Dan has access to that Joe doesn't, or vice versa? Or are there things that are more common here in the States than there are in Europe that would be considered, you know, high-end auction worthy?
I think, you know, we see a lot more Kodaks here than they do in Europe, I would guess. And I think, but I think of a lot of the really super collectible stuff, the one-offs, the prototypes, Betriebs cameras, they are usually still in Europe. And so I think that just it's a geographical line that I would draw, not so much the internet. And I think that since the 50s, when air travel became, although it was still a luxury thing, there was a lot more air travel. I think that some cameras did jump across the pond. But by and large, I think they're geographical lines. The lines I would draw with the internet have to do with, as I was saying before, about new people coming into the Leica space and gaining an understanding without actually having their hands on the item. Joe, what do you think?
I think in terms of, like, you mentioned that Leica 3D, the first one, which was a garage sale in the US. I mean, how often does something like that really happen? I would say once every 5 to 10 years, basically, for an item like that.
Right.
But the major rarities are in collections already. You don't find them on flea markets. I don't find anything on flea markets. I don't find rarely interesting stuff on camera fairs, because they are kept in collections, or move from collector to a collector either directly or via an auction. So it's really rare to find something out in the wild. It's extremely unlikely.
I have this theory that pretty much every camera that's out there is already on its second or third owner, we'll call it. There was probably a rash of time, maybe from 2005 to 2015, where a lot of the first wave of people who own cameras maybe either moved to digital and they were selling off their old film stuff, or even just the original owners of these cameras passed away and they got moved on. And it feels to me like we're in a little bit of a lull of, like you said, Joe, a lot of the really good stuff is already in a collection, right? I mean, I have a tiny collection compared to like what Ira has. And a lot of cameras that people might be interested in is sitting on his shelf or another person's shelf. And it's going to take no offense, Ira, but you're mortal. One day for them to go back into circulation, and we'll kind of see this like ebb and flow of collections that are already collected. So to find that needle in a haystack in a Pennsylvania garage sale, I would agree with you, because I even locally to where I'm at, I'm in near Chicago, and I used to trawl estate sales. And while I wasn't finding incredibly rare stuff, I would stumble upon like a nice Nikon S2, a nice Praktina or something with the motor drive or something like that. I would find that stuff from time to time. Once or twice a year, I would find an estate sale that had some pretty decent stuff in there. And even I'm not seeing that anymore too. So I kind of feel like that first wave, or maybe it was even a second wave already, who knows? But we're sort of in a lull right now where a large majority of collected stuff is already in a collection.
But on the other hand, I think about Bernard. I've got his catalog for his collection, and it was 3-volume PDF. I think it was like 100 pages long, had achingly rare cameras in it. And he would have staff that would go and like track down engineers from companies to get prototypes and get first edition and unused cameras. And the guy apparently vanishes, dies, passes away, had no family that seemed to be interested in the collection at all. As far as we can tell, nobody knows what happened to that collection. I mean, I know that it was in a series of climate controlled storage units, both in Miami and in Paris and possibly in Germany as well. I think he had 3 different storage units. And as far as I can tell, I've yet to find anybody that had any connection to him that knows what happened to any of those cameras.
If I could kick in here, because I'm going to be having to leave soon. I got a question here for Joe. And this is not Leica, this is Zeiss related. But they made a number of prototypes for the 10X2. They had a 35 millimeter f2 Biotar. They also made a couple other prototype lenses. I think there was a 75 Tessar. Does any of those things ever shown up that you know of?
No, I've never seen one. It's quite interesting, I think, because of Leica prototypes you find hundreds, basically. Zeiss is a real mystery. Stefan Baumgartner knows a lot, obviously, and a few other fellows also on Facebook, on the Zeiss historical groups, have seen more in their hands than I, much more. I have to say, a lot of it went to the US, obviously after the war, but then have been sold over the years. I think there was a large number of lenses, but not those lenses, sold via eBay. I think like 5 to 10 years ago. I can't remember exactly. But unfortunately, Zeiss is still, in my opinion, undervalued 100%. These things simply don't show up. There is one collection now which moved hands, I think 1 year ago or 2 years ago. I'm not sure, but you can find 2 or 3 or 4 lenses in the ivory finish on Facebook right now. These were from a very interesting collection, and they suddenly appeared. They're not in the Cuny book, for example, or anywhere. Nobody knew these really existed. Maybe rumors, but we've seen images now, which is really interesting. So time will tell. Same for Bernard's collection. It doesn't make any sense to get a headache. It either will show up, most likely in the US, most likely, I would say, or it will be thrown away. But it's very unlikely, very, very, very unlikely, because it's who burns a warehouse full of something, even if it would be metal boxes, people look into it, and now with the internet they can check. Bernard Danneberg couldn't check a lot when he was buying in the 80s and 90s online, it was basically impossible. Now people could do. So it's time will tell. It might take another 10, 20, 30, maybe 50 years, nobody knows, but it's very unlikely that it will be thrown away in these days. I would say 20, 30, 40 years ago, a lot has been thrown away because people couldn't check on the internet if it's worth something, but it will appear one day for sure. I'm quite sure. It must be a huge collection full of extremely interesting stuff.
The U.S. Signal Corps had picked up a Zeiss collection in the late 40s, and they brought home hundreds and hundreds of prototype lenses and just rarities, one-off kind of things too. I had written a short article that appeared in September 49 in Modern Photography magazine, where they had previewed a extremely wide angle camera, or like a lens actually, that was mounted to a camera that was like a one-off kind of thing. And I think that that's partially like what you said, Joe. Some of this stuff shows up in the US because I think it was military, had picked it up. And then a lot of that stuff wasn't documented. They didn't keep track of the serial numbers. Like, that's one of the greatest things about lights, is that if you're a Leica collector, you can look up a lot of information. I mean, even Nikon, hell, finding production numbers for a Nikon SLR from the 80s is harder than finding out about a 1930s Leica, right? I mean, Jim Lager has cataloged a huge percentage of the Luftwaffe cameras, all the wartime, the Heer and the Kriegsmarines. I mean, you can find that information relatively easily online, but practically any other company, it's very difficult to find. And I think with Zeiss, its location in Jena and Dresden, the Soviet Union got involved, and it just sort of destroyed a lot of that old record keeping. And I suspect that's why it makes it harder to do all that digging that's relatively easy to do with light stuff.
Yeah, 100%. I found a 18 centimeter direct mount prototype, but also found it in the US. But this was from a private seller, so he maybe bought it somewhere again in the US. But a lot of interesting Zeiss stuff appears in the US. I think much more than in Europe, actually.
One of the things that has been interesting to me is the internet and the way things have changed. My favorite story, this is from 1984, and Dan knows this guy. He was known in the U.S. as Mr. Leica. He had a chance to buy a Luxus. So he bought this Luxus, and it took almost 3 months for everyone to agree that it was really a Luxus, because he had to ship it from one person to another. Dan Tamarkin took a look at it. Jim Lager had the camera. A number of people had to see this camera to verify that it was indeed a Luxus. Today, with the internet, he could have done that in about five clicks of the mouse, just by verifying the serial number and sending out pictures. Back then, it took forever to establish that it was truly a Luxus camera.
I remember that camera. I remember my father looking at that camera. I was in the room, actually. I was a little kid, but I was in the room. I think that the internet is kind of a double-edged sword this way, to return to that phrase, because I think that, people, you're right, that people can verify, at least in a preliminary fashion, whether or not their camera has the right serial number. But very often it needs to have an actual in-hand evaluation. I mean, I've seen plenty of cameras that were not what they purport to be, and Luxus is at the top of that list. But they're spectacular cameras.
Very easily faked camera.
Yes.
But
can you quickly explain what a Luxus camera is that differentiates it from a non-Luxus one?
Yeah, it's a gold-plated, obviously. But not all of them are gold-plated, because luxury also meant like a calfskin covering on the camera body, or a lizard skin. But around 92 pieces have been made in gold-plated finish, and with the leather fixed in a special way on the camera. And many fakes don't have this fixation of the leather in the same way like the originals have. But what I wanted to mention is that a serial number only means nothing, basically. You can, or the fakers engrave the right serial numbers, because the serial numbers have been published in the HANE list since the 1980s, and they were easily forged. But you have to have a Luxus in your hands, maybe even dismantle it, because there are certain parts which I won't mention on the internet right now, or anywhere written or said, because people still fake those things, and You have to
That's
examine it really, really, really carefully. And there are very distinctive features. If you have it in hands, you can tell it like in 2 minutes or 1 minute, if you know what you're looking for. But this is really one of the hardest examples of identifying a fake camera.
Another camera that's similar to what you described, Joe, is everybody knows that pre-war, early war, Zeiss Icon made the Contax 2 and 3. And then after the war, the Soviet Union came in, took everything, moved it to Ukraine, and started making the Kievs. And then a couple years later in West Germany, the Contax 2A and 3A were made. But there was a very small number, in about 46, of Contax 2s that were built in Jena by ex-factory workers. And they basically made them exactly to the same specifications as the pre-war models. But there are a very small number of these post-war true German made in Jena. Is that what that is, Joe?
Yeah. There you go. Joe's got one in his hand.
He's got one right there. Okay, so is it true that it's similar? You have to have it in your hand or possibly even dismantle it to tell the difference? Is that true?
With this one, I'll show you, and I'll also explain it to the listeners, basically. So this one has a Carl Zeiss Jena and the logo, the condenser logo in the accessory shoe, and then a 5-digit serial number. Also, the ivory cameras had the same, but obviously in the ivory finished in. But on this one, it's on the outside. If you just receive an image without having an image of the accessory shoe, for example, you wouldn't notice a difference like that.
Right.
You
right.
just wouldn't. But on the Jena cameras, the serial number is also inside here and also here in the back door. And the back door is much heavier than the Dresden Contax 2, much heavier. The camera might be approximately the same weight, but the back door is much heavier. So you can identify that, but then you also have to have it in your hands. But these are one of the key features a Contax Jena has. Compared to the regular Contax 2, yeah. But I love that camera. It's really beautiful.
Well, I did not expect you to have one. Yeah, but that is cool. About how many of those do you know were made? That's true. I should have asked. Well, there you go. That's a good example of something it would be very easy to fake, but it's incredible. Like if someone were to contact you through the internet and say, "Hey, I got one of these cameras," you're going to be like, "Hey, that's great," but there's no way easily. I could tell you with absolute certainty because anybody can engrave a serial number. I mean, you have to go through additional checks and balances to validate that it's truly what it claims to be. Because the more people hear about this stuff, the more likely there are to find fakes. In fact, everybody knows about the Soviet cameras that get turned into Leicas. I'm not saying there's a lot of them, but I've started to notice in the last couple of years, you're starting to see like rare Japanese cameras like Tanax and Leotaxes that are actually Feds and Zorkis too. So the counterfeiters have moved on faking Leicas and they're starting to fake some of the less common Japanese rangefinders as well.
That's actually kind of where my next question's coming in as well is we've talked about the European cameras and obviously, based in Austria, that's going to be the main seller there, Joe. But is there collectible Japanese cameras that come through your auctions as well? That they're really high end? Is there something that really special from a Japanese point of view as well?
Let me think for a minute here. Obviously, yes. This was even a camera Mike had on his blog. It was the JC Leica copy, where he only made, I don't know, a handful or something. But this was a private sale through Mint and Rare. Not through the auction, I think like 6, 7, 8 years ago. And I sent Mike the images and he uploaded it, I think, to the blog as well, because there's only 1 or 2 images or were known until that time.
There was a very low quality image that floats around, and then I'd found out that you had a much nicer image and you let me use it. So that was super cool.
But yes, if it would be even there is a Leotax A or just the very first Leotax, I think it's called Standard, which has the focusing wheel for the the rangefinder is not covered, so it has a wheel on top. If something like that would pop up, it would be a dream in the auction because I've never even seen one, or just a picture of a camera, but not of a real camera, or maybe it's just of an illustration. I don't remember right now. But obviously, yes, there are certain Japanese cameras. We just had a question if we ever had a Minolta Sky. This would be a camera I dream of. That's a Leica copy, I think, with Leica M mount. Never made it into commercial production. Obviously, this would be extremely nice. We also had a Konica FR. It's not an RF. The rangefinder Leica M mount 2000s or 1990s camera. It's the FR is a Leica copy, a Leica M39 screw mount. I think I've shown a picture on a Facebook group as well. It's a very nice camera. Copar made the shutter for that camera. To me, it was the low standard quality camera, but they only made like 6 prototypes. So This makes the price, obviously, and not the quality of the build camera.
The Konica FR came out. They were working on it at the same time they were working on the Konica F, the first SLR, and it uses the same shutter. So I think they were toying with coming up with a premium rangefinder to compete with the Leica M3 or going with an SLR. And obviously they went the SLR route, even though the original Konica F wasn't very popular either. That camera I did get a chance to review. I would say the Konica F qualifies as rare because you cannot just go on eBay and find it at any one moment in time. But the FR is uber rare if both Ira and Joe have never even seen one. So
I've had it.
Oh, you did have one. Okay.
I sold it, yeah.
Oh boy. We saw one. Ira, you found one recently. It was just a shell, right? It wasn't a functioning camera, or he disappeared. Well, he did.
Yeah, I saw it on Yahoo Japan a couple months back.
Yeah.
And the camera was just the shell pieces, but the lens it appeared to be complete.
Okay.
And I think it sold for 8,000 US.
Yeah, and it was just the hollow outside. It was amazing. It just wasn't even a whole camera. So
yeah.
Those are cool. The Minolta Sky looks really neat. There was, and I'll just tell you too, and you probably know this, but there is a mock-up of the Minolta Sky that does exist, where they took another camera and just kind of fudged it, but it's not a true Minolta Sky. And Sky isn't even really the working name of the camera. The Sky, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's taken from a Japanese word that just means prototype camera. And people just call it the Sky because that's just sort of the unofficial name it was given. But I don't think if they ever were to have released it, it more than likely would have been part of the Minolta 35 series, maybe like a Model 4 or something along those lines. So we had Dan Cuny join us while we were talking. Dan, welcome back. We already did the intros, but you seem to know who's here. So did you have any questions for Joe or Dan?
No, one camera that just came to my mind was what was the first Canon rangefinder, the handset? I'm sure you guys have had those several times, but wouldn't that be considered a rare Japanese camera?
I would consider it rare if the vulcanite, if the leatherette wasn't falling off of the thing, then that's what would make it rare. I think that, these cameras were out there in the marketplace before anybody was really collecting them, before anybody even, Hansen was just another camera out there. So I think that a lot of them got used. That's really, I think the condition is king for a Hansa to really be out and out rare.
Interesting.
But, kind of like Joe was saying before, there you go, Joe, they had a really nice one a couple of years ago, last year, I guess.
This was actually in the first auction. A Canon Hansa is, of course, a very rare camera. The prototype of it was here we see it's the Quanon, the black one. But this camera is actually, I had it in my hands, I think it's the one I had in hand, and this one was not original. So this was made for a museum or whatever, and to put it on display, but this wasn't legit. Maybe this is, don't pin me on this one because the image is quite small, but the one I had in my hands wasn't original. But in the first auction, there is a difference between the first Hansas and the second ones. And the first ones had had that depressed area around the viewfinder and a few other examples and a very early number on the focusing mount. So this is even more rare and considered a pre-series in some way. but it wasn't actually. But I think on the Canon forum on Facebook, they counted like 15 pieces are known of this version of a Canon Hansa, which makes it even extremely more.
There is a huge number of variants of those original Canons, and something that's a lot, and I've made this mistake myself. We all call them Hansa Canons, but Hansa was really just the name of a retail outfit that helped sell them. And the cameras that they sold, they engraved Hansa on the top plate. So people call them Hansa Canons, but there are almost just as many that don't say Hansa Canon. They're just considered Canon rangefinders. So that's one of those things where like a name, it's sort of like, you know, the first generation Contax. You'll have the Contax A, B, C, D, E, F. Those letters were made up by collectors. Zeiss didn't actually do that. So we've, for the sake of identification or sometimes even just misinformation, we apply names to things that aren't quite right. But yeah, you're right. In terms of the indentations on the top plate, there's a lot of different variations of it. But that original Quanon, which is the picture I posted in the chat, I'll have it in the show notes. That's the only known picture of what people believe to be a real camera that was actually made. Most of what Canon was working, and they weren't even called Canon then, they were called Seiki Kogaku. What they were working on at that time mostly were just mock-ups, so they weren't complete cameras. But this one low resolution image of the black one appears to be the only one that was assembled. And for all we know, it's not even functioning. It may not even have a shutter in there.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Really for just Joe and Dan. Are there cameras that you've had in your hand that are surprising to you? I mean, is there a camera that you just pick up and you go, this is probably one of the most beautiful cameras I've ever seen? And if so, what are they?
100%. And this is one of the things I still think today that I should have bought in our own auction. It was a prototype, prototype again, of a Rollei stereo camera, but for 35mm film. And there were a handful made, or I made 10 pieces, all a bit different. And I think to this date, except if you want to own a Leica collection, but until today, I think I should have bought that camera for myself because I think it was the most beautiful camera I ever made.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
Very, very nice.
Was it one that you sold in a catalog? I mean, do you have a photo of it? Yeah, it's in one of your.
Yeah.
How about you, Dan? Is there one for you that just stands out?
Wow. Yeah, I don't know if there would be just one. It's kind of tough. I mean, because I am a collector, I tend to hold things that other merchants might not. I tend to just buy it all.
Wow.
I mean, there were a couple of cameras in the last auction that I thought were really spectacular that I would have loved to have owned, but that 35 Rollei that Joe was talking about was really
beautiful,
spectacular. And I'd be surprised if 10 were made. I mean, there are very, very few. I don't know. I mean, there's so many cameras that I just love. I can tell you there's a few that have gotten away. You know, there was a black paint M4 that was from the very first batch. And at the time, nobody really cared about the batches. And I don't know, I sold the thing for $4,000 or $5,000. I kind of wish I had that one back now. But other than regrets like that, I'm crazy about all these cameras. So they all, they all turn me on.
Do we want to go around the room and everybody list one camera that they just find to be incredibly pretty? It doesn't have to be rare.
To me, it's the Voigtlander Superb.
The Superb's up there. Yeah, that's a pretty
To
one.
me, that's just...
It's superb.
It's superb, exactly. I mean, there's
what
probably
an appropriate
others,
name. Yeah.
But that one just jumped into my head.
What about you, Theo? What's a pretty... So we know it's not the Mamiya 7. We're looking on just beauty.
Just beauty. It's probably actually more of the rarity that's actually... And I'll have to thank Anthony for reminding me of this in the chat. But and I need to ask Joe and Dan if they've got one and if they're willing to sell one for a really, really, really big discount. Is a Snider, the Australian Leica.
The Snider 35. It's a rebranded Nicca. He's flipping through the book. He may have one there for you. There you go.
There it is.
There it is.
Oh,
yeah,
that's a rare camera. Yeah, you don't see them every day.
I think there were like 10 maybe made or something like that. There weren't many.
They actually made, let me get back to the book. because we wrote it down.
Well, for the listeners, I'm really amazed that Joe can actually open up his books of the catalogs and actually go straight to the pages without looking at the table of contents, because that's
I love what I do every single day, you know.
I love what you do too.
There were originally 90 pieces ordered by the Australian importer, and less than 60 have been sold. The 30 other cameras have been destroyed, and I think I know of 6, 7, or 8 pieces.
Well, I said 10.
In existence.
That's not that far off. Mine's far more common than that, but by no means common. Yeah. But it's the Bell & Photon. I love the look of these things. Just kind of, it reminds me of the Streamliner, the camper, and it's got that kind of,
that's a beauty,
dark blue leather, and just there's something about the matte finish. It just looks so beautiful.
Yeah, that is really nice.
Wayne, we haven't heard from Wayne yet. Welcome to the show, Wayne. But I'm going to put you on the spot. What's a beautiful camera for you?
If it has to be one I own, it's the Minolta, the S or ALS
you
for you Americans. One I don't own, it's another Minolta, the Mini Flex 127.
That one?
Gorgeous colors, the little TLR. Yeah.
There you go. Dan's holding one up.
I think they're gorgeous.
They are nice.
Pretty. When Wayne said the Minolta, Gheerwijn held one up at a black one. I've not seen one in black before.
Mm-hmm. This is the P version.
The P.
Oh, the non-rangefinder.
Like I had one of those from Kurt's collection, a Minolta P in black.
Those are pretty. Brian McDomnhaill.
Hey guys. Yeah, I think I've kind of lusted after lots of beautiful cameras, but the only one I actually wanted that I knew I would use was one I bought from Joe, and it was a Canon P.
Canon P.
And it's definitely, I think, the best looking camera in my collection. And I love using it. I've been using it this week. Thanks, Joe.
Very pretty.
Thank you.
And I'm going to take Brian to lunch in May.
Oh,
yeah,
thank
he's going to be there.
I'm going to come down to see you in Cork.
Oh, very good. Very good. And this little camera was given to me by Paul. Pretty in its own way.
The LT1? Is that what that is?
That's the Olympus LT Zoom 105.
Oh, it's Zoom.
Very unusual, a very unusual looking point and shoot, but pretty for its class, I think.
I'm not going to get it down, but Minolta had that Prod 20s, that cheap plastic point and shoot, but it looks cool, where it was just like a regular plain Jane point and shoot camera, but they made it look retro. That came out, I think, in the late 90s at some point.
Yeah, I have one of those in the basement. The Minolta had the Prod 20 and Olympus had the Ecru.
Ecru, yeah.
Ecru and
the O product.
O product.
O product, yeah, that's another one.
But when you get to those retro weird cameras, the Rolly Q35. Do you remember that? That had the outboard potato masher flash unit?
Oh yeah, that's right.
That would have been what, 89 or 90, somewhere in the early 90s.
All the time when all the bridge cameras came out, I feel like every camera maker all at once decided, let's just start making some wacky design cameras and see what we could do. It's like they all decided at the same time, we're going to just throw existing design out the window and just see what sticks. And most of it didn't stick. Some of it did. Because we talked earlier in a previous episode, I really liked the Olympus IS cameras. That was probably one of the better bridge cameras out there. But back to Joe and Dan. It's always fascinating to me to just see that the stuff that continuously keeps showing up. Like I'm always waiting for the day to come where there's just no more rare cameras to sell. Do you feel like, is it as easy today as it was 10 years ago to get this stuff? Is it easier? About the same? Is it getting harder? Like, are we on a trajectory of running out of stuff to sell or no? No. Okay. So it's not a problem to keep filling your catalog.
I'll be no, it's not. No, I don't. Well, I mean, it's, it's hard work. It's not so easy. I mean, this stuff it doesn't just materialize out of thin air. I don't think that we're going to run out of rare cameras to sell because so many different cameras were made and the market is going to determine what they want. So there's not going to be any shortage of rare cameras to sell. I do think that we're going through one of the biggest transfers of personal wealth in the history of mankind at this time. And as a lot of collectors either divest or die or whatever, a lot of the stuff is changing hands. I think that it is more difficult these days to find the really highly collectible items, in part because of the internet. And so it is a challenge for me to convince people to sell their stuff at auction. It's usually only when they hear the price that it might bring that they say, oh, okay. But it's not so easy to find these things, and it's not so easy to get them.
I have a question for both Dan and Jo and everyone else, I guess, if I may. What I'm one of the younger serious collectors out there, I'd say. That's what I'm seeing. Obviously, online, there's definitely other people out there. But from what I'm seeing, I'm like, yeah, obviously going to fairs, buying and sharing the rare stuff I find. I find hunting it down. Do you guys like feel it's a thing that the younger generation is less interested in? Because that's for me, being in it is like my perception, because I rarely am able to talk about like the things I love collecting and I like collecting with people that are my age, and they're usually like twice or three times my age, that are like really into this stuff, especially when putting stuff to auction. Obviously you guys don't really necessarily see all the buyers, but I would imagine real life auctions or whatever, there's a certain demographic you guys sell to, right? Do you ever see that changing?
What you're trying to ask them, are you an anomaly, or are there other people like you?
It's like there aren't really that many people around my age, so I'm just wondering, is my world just too small? Am I missing those people, or is it just like the people that are really into collecting are just dying out or something?
Yeah, I'll let Jo and Dan answer that, but I'll answer first with something that Paul, Anthony, Theo, and I just talked about the other day, which is in regards to this show. We have not been very successful at attracting a younger crowd because we're talking about a lot of old vintage rare cameras that generally don't appeal. Like if we did an entire show and it was all just like Olympus point and shoots and, you know, the Contax G2 or whatever, I honestly don't even know what is popular amongst the point and shoot crowd. But when you get into, you know, who's really interested in a Footlander Superb or a Kodak Extra or, you know, any of these cameras we've mentioned, it is harder. And we don't know the answer to that question of where to find those people too. So I will say that from the perspective of just this show, it is hard to find people who like what we like that are younger than us. But Jo or Dan, if you want to add to that.
I think you still contribute very well because it's a new media. A podcast has never been done before. Like 5 years ago, there was no podcast about cameras, you know, and the younger generation listens to podcasts, and it's also shared on Instagram because Facebook is also not gaining the younger generation, you know, or getting the recognition it deserves in my view. But obviously you are right, and we are in a niche, maybe even the niche of the niche of the niche, I would say, because I'm not into point and shoot cameras. We had them, but we stopped, honestly. But I don't want to talk about point and shoot cameras. It's a very it depends on your pockets, but it's an expensive hobby that we share. It's not something for everybody. It's not for everybody's pocket. Of course, I don't think it has to do with demographics, maybe just a tiny bit actually, because it's good that you can buy now on the internet, you know, worldwide. But on the other hand, you can select from a huge range of conditions. And the new generation, I don't want to call it young generation, but the new generation of collectors are now after the best quality. And therefore the demand is still there, but the product isn't there. Vintage cameras or electronic vintage cameras like 1970s, 80s electric semi-automatic cameras don't get better. And that's also a point, you know. Then you have to go to mechanical cameras like a Nikon FM or whatever. I'm not talking about extra rare stuff here. And to go back, unfortunately, to point and shoot cameras, we used to sell them like in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, but the things aren't meant to work for 40 years. An Olympus camera that has been sitting in a drawer for 20 plus years and is now frequently used, and the zoom lens is stretching that elastic electric band or template or what's it called, that's not supposed to work today and in frequent use. And we had so many complaints. Unfortunately, I wish they were better, but those cameras aren't meant to be used today. If you have something like I don't know, a Leica or Leica, it's a fully mechanical camera. I think you can repair it in the next 50 years. But how many of those electric or early semi-automatic cameras are you going to be able to repair in the next 10 years?
Joe, it's funny you should mention that.
Anthony and I are going through this we're going through a thing right now.
Paul just bought a collection from a guy who bought a house from a guy who was a collector hoarder. And it was full of boxes of 80s and 90s Nikon equipment that had never even been opened and taken out of the box or unwrapped from the plastic. And having never shot an F4 before and just being curious about it, I picked up one of the F4s from Paul, and guess what? It don't work. Well, actually, part of it works. You can't use any autofocus lenses on it. It's either a solder bit that's gone bad, or a wire that's oxidized, or a circuit that's corroded. The autofocus is tot, and it's frustrating because this camera was absolutely. I was like, Paul was the first person to open the back. I was the first person to ever put a roll of film in it. It is literally brand new out of the box, and not working. I mean, it works as a manual focus camera, but it just doesn't work as intended.
I actually had 2 of them, and the one I still have is the same condition. It actually works, but for how long, we don't know.
But think about it this way as well. Now a working Nikon F4 in whatever condition is getting rarer. Just think about that right. in perspective,
But just think if that had been a Chrome M3 instead of a F4.
No problem to fix it though.
You wouldn't have a problem getting it fixed,
no,
right?
Yeah,
we've said on this show many times that we are at the cusp, and it's already within the last year or two started to happen. The number of people who can see Ur-Leica Contax in the United States has gone from 3 to 0. There's nobody left, at least reputable. That is. There are people who can still repair Alpas. There are people who can still repair, clockwork cameras, Kodak medalists. You can still get a lot of those cameras fixed today, but we are imminently at the point where you won't be able to do that anymore. And while there are still some younger people who are picking up the hobby and skill of repairing cameras, they're learning on the cameras that are the highest demand. So those are going to be your Leicas, right? I feel pretty safe saying we should be able to go a couple decades and you'll still be able to get a Leica 3 or an M3 serviced, more than likely, because those are going to be the cameras that have the most information. There's going to be people who will pass on that knowledge. It's documented, etc. But the cameras that are still being serviced right now by retired service people from the 70s and 80s, they are imminently stopping work and taking new things. I see all the time. Certo 6, who's that, Anthony? What's his name? Jurgen. Yeah, Jurgen recently retired. Anthony was able to convince him to take one last roll around the park and got one of his cameras serviced. I've heard the guy, Greg Weber, recently stopped taking work. A couple other people have just stopped. And the fact that you can get a Leica still fixed and is still going to be just as good as new as it was, that's something that is unique to right now, which we may not have access to in even 5 years from now.
Yeah, but I won't put all the, let's call it, blame on repairers who stop working. It's also the product, I have to say. Things are getting, the electric stuff, as I mentioned, is not getting better,
Right.
And this camera is 80 years old. If I would look like that, if I'm 80 years, I would be extremely happy. But and who can fix me then? But it's also the material. Even I have to say, but it's an honest opinion. And even a Nikon F3 now, the LED display is
fades.
Yeah.
And fades and even stuff like that, which used to be very reliable like 5 or 10 years ago is now
Leica M6 meters, reflect circuit in Leica M6 meters. Leica says they're going to come out with more of them to replace for the new camera, but who knows? The one thing that is happening though, and it's like X-Pans, Hasselblad X-Pans, Yashica or Contax G2s, cameras like that rely on circuit boards that aren't working. There is a small industry in China who are making those circuit boards. And whether they work well or not, I don't know. I personally would not be comfortable sending one out for the trial, but there is talk that somebody is going to continue to make them.
From my experience, what we did is we ordered those circuit boards or those FlexiBands for the Minilux, for example, for the Leica Minilux, for the E02 era. And we tried to fix like 10 cameras. It worked like in 6 of them, and in the first 3 months, 4 of those 6 came back. Same error. No, thank you. Now, for me, that's an expensive doorstop in the end, basically. If a customer walks in to our shop and says he wants that camera, I'll explain that story in every detail. If he still wants it, fine, no guarantee. Because I won't tell him he can't use it 100% in the next 5 years, but it's very unlikely. Same with the Contax T2, T3, Contax G2, X-Pen, maybe X-Pen as well. Not much experience with those spare parts from China for the X-Pen. But we tried it with several cameras and game over, I would say, unfortunately.
I agree, Joe. I think it's very difficult. I think that items that were made, such as the Contax G2 and T2 and X-Pan and Leica R4, for example, talk about a doorstop. I think that these cameras, they were not made in the same way that the Jena Contax or the Leica or the Leotax or the Reed or any of these other mechanical cameras were made. And I mean, would you try to fix a Betamax if you had? Would you fix your VCR if you had a tape that you wanted? Probably not. You'd send the tape off to have it digitized. And so I think that in answer to Mike, your earlier question of whether or not we're going to run out of rare stuff to sell, I don't think so. I mean, the good Lord's not making any more cameras in 1960. That year is done. So I think that it may become more difficult to encounter a working Leica M4 in black paint that's never had any parts replaced. But at least the parts can be replaced, I think that's the most important part.
And I'm still holding out hope that 3D printing will help to some degree, maybe not quite with all the tiny precision parts, but I'm hoping that the technology will continue to evolve and we will sort of bottom out on what we can replace and start, not everything, of course, but there will be some things we'll be able to remake brand new again that previously weren't. Gheerwijn mentioned that replacements for the M6 meter already exist. Amsterdam Camera Repair just came out with some new ones. So on occasion, something that was unavailable for decades can reappear, and we just got to cross our fingers and hope that trend continues.
I just want to come back to a question from Theo previously, because he asked about the Japanese cameras or Leica copies, for example, and he asked about the Snider, and then I reached back in my shelf in here because I really also like and love this tower camera here, which has the lever actually and an opening back door as well. And I think actually this camera is made maybe better than a Leica 3 or a 3A or whatever. And the cost is like, I don't know, similar or quite the same actually. But this is a beautiful example of a Japanese camera that is fully mechanical, still working, can be bought for, let's call it quote unquote, a bargain compared to, I don't know, like a 3G or whatever. And I think that's something that in pristine condition that is rare, and that can't be a bad, I don't like to call cameras investment because they're not, you have to be extremely lucky if you make a lot of money if you buy and sell something after collecting it for a decade. But what I wanted to say is that buy condition, buy the best condition possible.
It's a gorgeous camera.
Hopefully we're past the point where people are throwing cameras in garbage, so the number of nice cameras will hopefully stay. Speaking to what I said earlier, the ebb and flow, things are in collections right now. At some point they will reappear on the market. That's actually a question I meant to ask earlier and I forgot. For Dan or Joe, how often or have you ever sold the same camera twice?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. 3, 4 times in some instances. I own an M6 TTL 0.58. That's one of the film cameras that I use. My all-time favorite camera is a button rewind Leica M2. Sexiest camera there is. Couldn't care less what lens you put on it. My favorite camera of them all. And that actually distracted me from what I was going to say. Look, every time we mention a camera, Joe turns around and on the shelf behind him, look at that, Joe. Do you need a home for that? Or are you going to sell that to me? I'll buy it from you. He's going, no.
It's his.
That's yours.
He's his.
Yeah, I love the M2. I really do. I don't even remember the question. I got so sidetracked by Joe's M2.
Selling cameras more than once. I know Paul. It happens to Paul all the time because he would get people he sold things to at the store.
Oh, sure. And that's the beauty of what we do. And I know that Paul and Joe are the same way. And although I haven't had a lot of dealings directly with some of the other folks on this call, I'll say that Miles and Mike are the same as well, in that it's all about the relationships. And when you have a good relationship with somebody look, Joe is not going to have the thing that y'all want every single day. I'm not going to have it every single day. But if you have a relationship as a collector, as a buyer, or as a curious party, no matter what your age, no matter what your pocketbook, no matter what your status, and I'm using air quotes around that word status, which I loathe, that you create a relationship with the people, the other collectors and the dealers and the auction houses that you like. And I can tell you that from my perspective, sitting here in Chicago, I would much rather have strong relationships than I would high sales figures, because the first leads to the second.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question about age. What would be the average age of your collectors, Dan and Joe? And the second question is, if these collectors die, would it be a huge flow of cameras in 20 years?
I'll just answer by saying 489, and yes. Most of our consigners are getting up there in age. Yeah, most of them.
Well, I don't know that data, to be honest, as exactly as I wish. But I think it's definitely 50, 60 plus, I would say. Yeah.
So, real quick, and I'll follow up something, Gheerwijn, you said earlier about being one of the younger guys that's really into collecting. My best advice for you or anybody who's newer, regardless of your age, but if you're just new to this hobby, just stick with it, right? Like, you can't really see my shelf behind me, but most of you have been to my website, and I have a lot of really cool stuff. I don't have anywhere near as cool stuff as Joe does, but I have some pretty cool stuff, and that didn't happen overnight. Stick with it, build those relationships like Dan's talking about. Dan would not have appeared on this show. I think this is the 5th time you've been on, Dan, if he didn't like what we do, right?
I love this.
Yeah. Paul has shared so many stories of people where he used to be Paul, the camera store guy. And then he became Paul, the eBay guy. And more often, Paul's like, oh, you're the guy from the podcast. So while I'm not saying go out and make another podcast, I mean, you make another podcast if you want, but that's not strictly what I'm saying. But stick with it, build the relationships, talk to people, get knowledgeable. And like what Dan just said, 1 will lead to 2 and 1 will lead to 10, which will lead to many. And if you're younger or you're new into this hobby and maybe you're just thinking I can't afford some of these cameras, you may never be able to afford them, but they will appear, and you will have opportunities. And if you're patient, that's always been my best tip, is if you're looking for something that's hard to find or out of your price range, just be persistent, be patient. One day you'll never know when that rare camera is going to show up at a Pennsylvania garage sale or an estate sale or somewhere. So honestly, it's usually somebody's like, yeah, my uncle had some cameras, and he died, and would you be interested in them? And you just never know, but they will appear.
That's right. I agree. And I love it that there are younger folks coming in
to
Leica and to the collectible camera space. I love it. I was a young man when I started. I couldn't afford anything. I bought the simplest, smallest stuff that I could. I still fell in love with it. And we welcome the younger, the better. And it does not, we tell people all the time when they come to our auctions to our store, less so for our auctions, leave your checkbook at home. Just come in and experience the Leica and see what it's all about. And then you start saving or not. Do whatever you want, but come and buy a camera or go to auction, whatever it is you like. But we always try to welcome those younger collectors and those younger shooters, because those are the people that are going to be filling out the camera space in the next 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, I'm a young fella, but I'm not going to be around forever.
Right.
So we got to have younger people in the space.
Also consider, I mean, apart from the fact that I still consider myself young, so up yours to everybody that says otherwise. The actual thing is, when you do start collecting, don't be afraid to go and offer someone something that you think is reasonable. Be respectful, but offer something reasonable. But sometimes people will sell you something because, you know, it's got family history to it and they want to see it go to a good home.
Yes.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, that $1,000 camera that's being sold there and you offer something reasonable. I'm not saying going in and offer $20. They may be really happy to see someone take it and actually use it or collect it
for sure,
because they feel like they don't want it to be destroyed or go into the nether. So there is opportunities out there. It's just a matter of being respectful to people at the same time.
And I loved the one time I came to visit you, Dan, you gave me an hour of your time and I ate every second of it up. But when I was done, my hour was up. A young lady came into the store that had an appointment. She had bought an M6 from you and she wanted help using it. And you sat down and you went over the exposure triangle. You went over just the basic functions, how to focus on a rangefinder. And she was young. I mean, if I had to guess, 20 maybe, I don't know, but I was just so impressed that somebody came in there and wanted to learn, and they're learning the right way from someone who knows what they're doing. I want to encourage people, and speaking to what I mentioned earlier, we really are trying to cater to younger people. I realize this episode specifically talking about so many high dollar cameras probably isn't the best way to go about it. So maybe we'll have to have a counter to this show and have an episode where we talk about all the affordable cameras, you know, Nicca mats and stuff, and Canon Ps, you know, granted, yeah, those aren't dirt cheap, but they're still reasonably priced cameras that you could pick up and are fun to shoot and make excellent images and will last a long time too. But we are running short on time here. I want to start to wind things down, be respectful of Joe and Dan and all your guys' time. Does anybody have any last minute questions that they had wanted to ask or comment on before we get going?
I think we explained the whole camera market in close to 2 hours, basically.
Sure.
Nobody has any questions anymore.
Yeah, we answered them all.
That's right. We've done this so perfectly that no one has any questions.
But check the screen here. I mean, it's one quarter is, I don't want to offend anybody, but I think below 40 or even 30. So I think that's pretty good, actually, you know. So a podcast is the right media, I think, you know, but it's going in a good direction, I would say, you know. When it comes to cameras sold back and forth to customers, I think I hold the record in Austria at least, because I've got one camera which went from customer A to me to customer B, and then the same thing back and forth to the same two customers 3 times.
I'd love to hear that.
A, B, A, B, B, A, B, B. That was fun. And also not matching to the episode of rare cameras and high value cameras, but something fun which I recommend to do. If you go onto a camera fair with fellow collector friends, do something we called the ugly or worst camera contest. Check out the worst camera you can buy for $10 and see what comes out. That's fun. It adds something to your collection, adds a story to your collection, a story with your friends or collector fellows to your collection, to your memory, and go on from there. It's really fun. You know what we found? Somebody found a Nikon F and claimed it was the ugliest camera on the planet, which I don't think. But anyway, go out, do stuff like that. Be a bit silly from time to time. It doesn't hurt you. it just adds to the experience.
What a great idea, Joe. I love that. Next time I go to a camera fair or a flea market, I'm going to do that. It's a terrific idea.
Dan, why don't you come down to Cincinnati for the show?
I'd love to. I got to look at my schedule. Let me
That's
tell you,
a great
Tamarkin's going to go on tour this year. So
okay, come down to the show. Come down to the show. It's the one that Mike Walensky runs.
Maybe I should come up for that show.
Ray Nasson will be there. It's going to be really a fun show.
Dan, you will have to drive literally past my house to get there, so I'll carpool with you.
That sounds great, Mike. I look forward to it.
We can stop off in Indianapolis and get some Jack in the Box.
Oh yeah, we're going to be driving the Leica mobile, so it'll
go to Long's Donuts for the apple cider donuts.
There you go.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Hey, before we go, I gotta thank Tom Zoss. Tom's here. He's been quiet, but I gotta say, Tom sold me what is now currently my favorite camera of all. It was one that S.K. Grimes put together from an old Graflex XLSW body and put a 47 millimeter 4.5 Rodenstock lens on it, the Grandagon. And I've had more fun with that camera with a 6x9 back than, I mean, it's got me shooting black and white again, which I'd sort of dropped away from for a while. Tom entrusted me to be the steward for that camera, and I'm really enjoying it.
I just wanted to thank everybody for helping me learn some stuff today.
I was going to talk about my favorite, most beautiful camera, and it's actually one that was one of my introductions to my friend Bernard, because I bought 4 copies of this camera from Bernard, and it's the Kodak Medalist. I actually have an early prototype Medalist that he sold me that he was working with the Eastman Kodak House to document its history, because it was an early Medalist that is probably a prototype. But it was designed by Walter Dorwin Teague, who is, I mean, the guy is one of the great American Art Deco industrial designers. He's an artist, and it's a chance to own a camera that is literally a work of art. And that camera, the way it handles, the crazy focusing lens, the helicoid, the weight of it, the curves, the way that it feels in your hands when you're shooting it, it's a work of art. I mean, it is literally something that you would see on the display at the Museum of Modern Art as an example of Walter Dorwin Teague's industrial design. And, you know, it just, to me, it doesn't get any better than that, because it really draws together this American idea of streamlining and just beautiful Art Deco design and industrial production and art. And you can use it to create art. And it's just, to me, it's just like the perfect storm of coolness for an American camera.
I want to thank Joe for coming on. We started talking, I think, in November or something to arrange this to happen. The holidays threw us off a little bit, and scheduling a time that works for everybody's time zone isn't always the easiest thing to do. But we do value your time and your knowledge and your expertise. So thank you coming on. You are welcome anytime. Don't wait for an invitation. We record typically in the middle of the night for you. So
no, thank you very much for having me. You know, I would love to join
yes.
more often, obviously, but as you mentioned, it's in the middle of the night. Sometimes I'm awake and I think about joining, but then I fall asleep in 5 minutes.
No worries.
But I hear it in the next couple of days when it's going online. So
sure. We will edit this and get it out in about a week or so. I'll be sure to send you a link, but it'll appear on all the common podcast network. So thank you for coming on. One thing that we may ask for your help in the future is, this is the 85th episode of this show. And while the L word, Leica, gets mentioned on almost every episode, not all, contrary to popular belief, we have done some shows and never once said Leica, but we've never really dedicated an entire episode to Leica. So I'd love to one day be able to put together like a Leica super episode, and, you know, yourself or Lars, I think, would be an incredible resource if he was interested in it. I've reached out to Jim Lager a number of times. He's helped me with some things. He sent me a copy of his book, but he's not very confident in his technological ability. So I would love to find a way to do something like that and just hear some of the stories and, you know, just share that kind of knowledge so that it's preserved and people could hear about it through the podcast format. But thank you, as always, Dan. Thank you for dedicating some time in the middle of the day. You could be out there selling things, but instead you decide to spend it with us. So I appreciate that.
My pleasure. There's nothing I'd rather do. Thanks, guys, for having me.
Fernando, Wayne, Brian, Tom Zoss, Miles, Gheerwijn, you guys stuck with us. A few people have dropped off. Our next episode will be episode 86. We will record it 2 weeks from today, which is meaningless considering you won't hear it until, so I should probably say February 10th. We will record it at our regular time. Right now, the plan is to go over adapting lenses. That was one of the requests from the Facebook page. Paul made a great post soliciting for some feedback, and people want to hear about all the different lenses, how you could adapt lenses, what works, what doesn't, such like that. And we have some exciting shows coming up after that. I don't want to go too far ahead because as things often do, they can change. But we will record episode 86 on February 10th at 7 o'clock Central Time, 8 o'clock Eastern Time in the United States. You could use the World Time Buddy to figure out how that applies to your time zone. As always, the topics and discussions on the Camerosity Podcast are influenced by you. We want to hear from everybody as often as possible, new, old, young, whatever. Thank you guys all for coming, and everybody have a good rest of your day.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Nice, thanks.
Adios. Bye.
Adios. Adios.
Seeing you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
But what I wanted to say on the show, which I forgot, is we have to encourage collectors to make lists, you know, not just to put it in a closet or a cabinet or whatever. Just please make lists, make an inventory, or note to the relatives where you bought it or where you want to have that stuff, where you want to have that stuff after you pass away. You know, it's an important part basically, and there's great respect from my side for every collector who does sell on their own, like in their 80s or 90s, whatever, just to that the relatives don't have the burden to deal with it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's a good point.
It's a really important point, you know. Just or put a name card somewhere. I don't care if it's my card or Paul's card or Dan Tamarkin. Just put a name card, because things are getting thrown away, and we have to work against that, I would say, you know, combined actually.
Yep.